Good morning on this sober and solemn day of remembrance, the first anniversary of the October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel. I wanted to share an essay I wrote just days after that. There aren't words for the evil, the tragedy, the suffering that was unleashed upon our world that day. But I'm a writer. It's my job to try to find words, even when there don't seem to be any words. So I want to share with you some words that I found. A menorah in my window, a Christian woman's love letter to Israel. It's just a cheap wooden children's menorah, intended as a teaching aid and not as a ceremonial object. It was painted a gaudy blue, with a pasteboard cutout of a train attached to the wooden backing with springs, and it held 8 wooden candles that fit into the holes on top like pegs into a cribbage board. My mom would have called it tacky. My menorah was a far cry from the precious ancestral menorah of the story of the lost menorah, to which I listened breathlessly on NPR every Hanukkah. It bore no resemblance to the family menorah in the story that Leonard Nimoy so tenderly narrated in Hanukkah in story and song. But it was the only menorah left in the Hobby Lobby, and I wanted it in time for the Hanukkah 2018 to teach my children the story of the Jewish Festival of Lights. The 2008 Tree of Life Synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh woke me up to the horror of rising anti-Semitism. This wasn't resentful rumblings on social media or on my university campus. This was the slaughter of innocent people at worship, and it was close to home. Like so many people at that time, I reached out to my Jewish friends to ask how I could help. And it was then that I learned of the custom of non-Jewish people placing unlit menorahs in their windows to signal solidarity with the Jewish people. So I put my silly little teaching menorah in the window along with a Star of David pillar candle and my Christmas lights. They stay up all year round. I made latkes from the handwritten recipe given to me by a Jewish grandmother, braided challah bread, read the Hanukkah story to my children, and prayed for my Jewish brothers and sisters. I believed then, and I believe even more strongly now, that the only way to combat the rising tide of anti-Semitism in our world is to instill in our children a love of the Jewish people. I thought nothing could feel so close and so personal as the Pittsburgh synagogue attacks. But when I woke up early the morning of October 7th, 2023, to the news that the state of Israel was under attack and that a state of war existed between Israel and Hamas, I knew that I was wrong. This time, I knew and cared about someone who was in danger. I have a professional correspondence with author and literary agent Rena Rosner of the Deborah Harris Agency in Jerusalem. It would be days before I got word that Rena and her family were safe, locked in their home and praying for better days. There are no words, only anguish and tears. Sorrow too deep to be eased by tears, by the atrocities committed that day. But for me, the most horrifying spectacle was the outpouring of anti-Semitic hatred in direct response to the unspeakable horrors unleashed in Israel. The anti-Semitism from the political left, from academia, from activists of all stripes appalled me, but very sadly did not surprise me. As a recent university graduate, I've been watching that tide rising for years. But the worst anti-Semitism I saw, the kind that hurt my heart the most, was the outpouring of anti-Semitic hatred from my Christian brothers and sisters. As a Christian woman, I was raised fundamentalist evangelical, Plymouth Brethren. Love for and kinship with the Jewish people and fealty to the state of Israel is woven into the very warp and weft of my being. Until 3 days ago, at the time of this writing, it's now been a year and 3 days, I assumed all Christians felt the same way. Growing up in the fundamentalist evangelical sect of the Tunbridge Wells Plymouth Brethren, that's what Garrison Keillor describes as the sanctified brethren in Lake Wobegon, I was privileged. The older I get, the more I realize how privileged I really was, to sit under the sound of thousands of hours of lectures on the tabernacle, the offerings, the feasts, the chronicles of the kings of Israel, and the prophets, and the Psalms. Thanks to the cassette tape player, I know, high tech, I could listen to those recorded lectures at home. And listening to those lectures together was a favorite way for me to spend time with my dad, and it still is. We talk over everything that we learned together. We ingested the stories of the children of Israel leaving Egypt with our mother's milk. We cut our teeth on the story of David and Goliath. I learned the story of Ruth, for whom I am named, long before I could appreciate the timeless beauty of the love story. When we grew a little older, we learned to stand strong in the face of temptation by reading about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who wouldn't bow, and they wouldn't bend, and they wouldn't burn. We dared to be a Daniel. When we were older still, we learned the parallels between the time of ruin and rebuilding in Ezekiel and Nehemiah and the time of ruin and rebuilding within Christendom today. To this day, my best friend and I can say to each other, Elijah by the brook Kidron, or Elijah in the wild gourds, or Naaman and the little maid, and have a complete story and moral immediately come to mind. Being a female intellectual and nerd, as I was as a child and I am still, was simply not the thing in the culture in which I grew up. But I think the lecturers found the wide-eyed, intense listening of my young self at least mildly encouraging. I also spent countless hours in private, curled up in the reading corner of my room, reading the Old Testament for myself, with a special interest in the prophetic books from Isaiah to Malachi, marking up my Bible, memorizing whole passages. I did not understand this at the time, but I was taking the stories of the Jewish people into my very being and braiding their stories together with my story. We read the Bible together every night as a family, not even skipping the piles of bloody foreskins and those awful jawbreakers in Chronicles. They weren't just funny names. They were people who had lived and suffered like us. We read from the 1611 King James Authorized Version for the beauty and majesty and poetry of the language, and I do still today, because that's what I've memorized. Not only did we read the Bible, we sang it constantly. Our very hymnody was studded with allusions, not only to the River Jordan and the Promised Land, but to Eshcol's grapes and the water of Marah and the manna in the wilderness. My best friend's mother sang Psalm 131, "Let Israel hope in the Lord," as a lullaby. And we sang the 25th Psalm as a canon, as a round. Today, when I see Christians just casually dismissing the Old Testament as not important because we have the New Testament now, casually dismissing the Jewish people as not important because the church has replaced the nation of Israel, I'm heartsick. But the absolute worst response to the Hamas attacks that I've seen from the Christian community, the Jews had it coming because they killed Jesus. I trust I am speaking as a representative of all of Christendom when I categorically condemn this statement. You cannot be a Christian and believe that the Jews are solely responsible for the death of Jesus our Lord. Christians believe that the crucifixion of Jesus was committed by everyone and for everyone, and that the blood of Jesus is not a condemnation of the Jewish people, but rather a fulfillment of the story of the spotless lamb sacrificed at Passover, and that we are protected by the blood on the lintel and on the two side posts. By definition, condemning the Jewish people for the death of Jesus is un-Christian. If there was ever a time when people of the Judeo-Christian tradition and beliefs needed to come together in love and sorrow, it is right now. There is a tide in the affairs of men that has produced such evil as our world has not seen since the Holocaust. And if we are to overcome, we have to overcome that evil and that hatred with goodness and love. We Christians cannot afford to sit up on our high horses and turn up our noses at the suffering of our Jewish brothers and sisters. Because without Israel, there would be no Christ and no Christians. To put it in St. Paul's words, we non-Jews were the ones who were grafted into Israel, and not vice versa. I stand for and with Israel. It's not a slogan for me. It's not a flavor of the month thing like a Ukraine flag or a black square or a watermelon emoji. It's not the next thing until the next tragedy takes place. Nor is it a political stance. I was raised and have largely remained, although I am a Christian conservative, rather apolitical. I have been standing for and with Israel since I was an 11-year-old apolitical nerd girl, deep diving into eschatology. And I'm not about to shift my moorings at this late date. The love and kinship for the Jewish people was nurtured in those formative years. Poring over the Old Testament was deepened when I read the heartrending accounts of Jewish suffering in Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, was nourished by a deeper acquaintance with Jewish history and mythology in Rena Rosner's Sisters of the Winter Wood and the Light of the Midnight Stars, and is affirmed as a permanent part of my soul in the last few days, in fact, the last year, of praying for war-torn Israel. My silly little teaching menorah wasn't visible from my window. And even if it had been, the small New England village where I call home isn't exactly known for its anti-Semitism. You have to go further south in Maine for that, I grieve to say. That menorah was merely symbolic of a resolution forming in my heart. I hope that this essay will serve as a visible menorah in my window, a sign of love for and solidarity with the Jewish people, and a call to my fellow Christians to love likewise. And the words of the Old Testament woman for whom I am named are my words to the Jewish people. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part me and thee. And may the lamentation of the prophet Jeremiah be the prayer and lamentation of every one of us. Arise, cry out in the night. At the beginning of the watches, pour out thine heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift up thine hands before him for the life of thy young children, which faint for hunger at the top of every street. The people of Israel live, and your Christian brothers and sisters love you. May God bless you.